2月25日，国民大会正式通过了《中华民国宪法》。
In 1946, the National Constituent Assembly announced the Constitution of the Republic of China had been passed. The Republic was to become a constitutional government. In the Constitution of the Republic of China, passed on December 25, 1946, articles related to local autonomy were based on the Constitution of Canada, a country that encouraged local autonomy. However, seeing the political and social chaos after Taiwan was ruled by the Republic of China, and even though they had waited for the Constitution, Taiwanese intellectuals felt pessimistic regarding Taiwan's constitutional democracy. On the day after the Constitution was passed, the biggest private-owned newspaper in Taiwan, Minbao, reminded the public in its editorial that a constitution and constitutional government were different. It called upon the government and the people to act. Otherwise, any constitution would be merely a formality. Taiwan was then a province in the Republic of China, but it had representatives in the National Constituent Assembly. Taiwanese intellectuals were educated during the Japanese colonial period, and they were able and interested to discuss constitutional issues because they had been ruled by a constitutional government. This film will start from the historic experience of the Taiwanese people. The National Diet Building in Chiyoda, Tokyo, used to be the Imperial Diet of Japan. The Diet was composed of the House of Peers and the House of Representatives. During the colonial period, apart from Gu Xianrong and Lin Xiantang, who were elected into the House of Peers, no member of the House of Representatives was Taiwanese. Taiwan was Japan's first colony. Initially, special policies were implemented here. Laws passed by the Imperial Diet did not necessarily apply in Taiwan. In 1896, the Imperial Diet passed Law 63, the fundamental law governing Japanese rule in Taiwan. The colonial governance based on Law 63 allowed the Japanese Governor-General of Taiwan to exercise executive power, legislative power, partial judicial power, and even military power. Taiwanese people and even Japanese living in Taiwan could not enjoy the same rights and obligations as did the citizens in Japan. In 1907, Lin Xiantang met Liang Qichao in Nara, Japan. Liang told Lin frankly that China could not help Taiwan over the next 30 years. He encouraged Taiwanese people to follow the example of the Irish, who fought through the parliament for their rights in Great Britain. Born a landowner, Lin Xiantang was the leader of colonial resistance within the system.
The bourgeoisies led Taiwan's resistance against Japan in the 1920s. They believed that the cost was too large to start an independence revolution against Japan. They had seen what happened in 1919 when Korea, another colony of Japan, started the Samil independence movement. The movement was suppressed by Japan with thousands of deaths and even more arrested.
In 1914, Lin Xiantang invited the pioneer of the Meiji Restoration, Taisuke Itagaki, to Taiwan, hoping he could help the Taiwanese fight for their rights. Itagaki proposed the idea of comprehensive assimilation between the Taiwanese and Japanese, so that Taiwanese could enjoy the same rights as the Japanese did in Japan. He helped establish the Taiwan Assimilation Society. Taiwanese members in the society felt they were campaigning for equal political treatment, but the term assimilation implied that Taiwan could lose its cultural identity.
Historians believe that the Assimilation Society was a society composed of different groups because Taiwanese and Japanese members pursued different goals. Taiwanese members wanted to improve their political status. This was very important for them.
In short, Law 63 was the source of Japan's disparate treatment of the people in Taiwan.
6.3法撤廃運動というのは、その基本的な発想はおそらく台湾人の側の発想は平等を要求しているんですね。差別に反対して平等を要求するためにその不平等の根拠になっているのがいわゆる6.3法であるからね。だからそれを撤廃しろということだったと思いますね。だからそれは台湾同化会に林剣道などが参加したのと基本的には同じ発想だったと思いますけれども、第一次大戦の後になるとやはり世界的な民族自決の潮流とかが出てきたから発想が転換したと思います。
However, in order to fight against the authoritarian system through assimilation into Japan, Taiwan would have to give up its own history and culture. For the Taiwanese intellectuals, the price for the Constitution and civil rights was too high. Gradually, resistance movements headed towards different directions.
If Law 63 were to be successfully abolished, Japanese colonial rule in Taiwan would have to follow laws passed by the Imperial Diet. Politically, Taiwan would become a part of Japan. Such a possibility was debated by Taiwanese students in Japan. They feared that Taiwan would agree to be assimilated into Japan. In the 1920s, Taiwanese people who were ruled by the Qing government possessed a strong recognition for the Han culture, and they were against the idea of assimilation.
This is Sanshu Sha, a printing firm. The magazine Taiwan Youth was printed here in the 1920s. Lin Cheng-lu, a graduate from Meiji University, Japan, published an article in Taiwan Youth, arguing that the abolition of Law 63 signified the denial of Taiwan's uniqueness. Hence, an idea was formed to set up a special representative body which took Taiwan's special situation into account.
For Lin Cheng-lu
and other political elites, rather than asking for the right to vote in the Imperial Diet, the Taiwanese needed to ask for a colonial parliament in Taiwan. Which could check and balance the executive power of the Governor General. There were two reasons for setting up the Taiwan Parliament. First, Taiwan would become an independent area that held elections. Second, the Parliament could balance and check the Governor General's power. Such were the rights given to its citizens by the Meiji Constitution.
Taiwanese wanted to enjoy the same civil rights that Japanese had, but they also wanted to maintain the uniqueness of Taiwan. This presented a very difficult challenge.
Starting from 1921, every year, the petition delegation boarded a ship from Geelong and traveled 5 days and 4 nights to Kobe. They then took the train to Tokyo. Taiwanese students in Tokyo welcomed the delegation with flags that read "Freedom and Equality." Taiwanese students in Japan once received the petition delegation from Taiwan in the cafe Takada Bokusha near Waseda University. Lin Cheng-lu, Jiang Weishui, Cai Peihuo, and Hong Yuan-huang discussed how to persuade Japanese congressmen and journalists to ensure the petition was recognized by Japan's political arena and press. Xie Donghan was the son of Xie Wenda, the first Taiwanese pilot during the Japanese colonial period. He described to us the third petition movement on February 11, 1923, in vivid detail. My father flew the plane purchased with funds raised in Taiwan and dropped 80,000 leaflets on Tokyo. The leaflet was very appealing. It described Taiwan under the rule of Law 63 and how such a rule was a shame to constitutional Japan. Please give the Taiwanese human rights. The creative protest of Shewon-da was the highlight of the petition movement, and it surprised Tokyo.
台湾議会設置制が運動が出てきたのは日本の年代で言えば大正真ん中ぐらいですから、この時は全体的な雰囲気としては戦前日本の戦前では、戦争の時期とかいわゆるファシズムの時期に比べて言論の自由とか、民主主義の要求とか、それから社会主義運動もありましたから、社会的に非常に言論も社会的な動きも活発だった時期ですね。戦前で少し日本人は幸せな時期だったんですね。でいろんな思想の可能性が出てきた時期ですよ。ですからやっぱり植民地に対してもの人々に対しても一種の、言説を作り上げたり発表したりする可能性は空間はそのおかげで少し広がってたんじゃないかと思います。
In the 1920s, public health in Taiwan had improved, and the mortality rate was lowered. The life expectancy of boys born in Taiwan had increased from 27.7 years in 1906 to 38.8 years in 1930. Within 24 years, the life expectancy had increased by 11 years. During the colonial period, traditional agriculture in Taiwan had started to employ various new farming technologies. The accumulated wealth stimulated commercial development. Social grassroots leaders emerged, infrastructure was improved, and Taiwanese society was moving from a closed one to an open one. After the Meiji Restoration, Japan had a better foundation for industrial development, so Japan's rule had a positive impact on Taiwan's economic development. The petition movement for Taiwan Parliament started in the 1920s, an important transition period for social change in Taiwan. However, the Japanese government was concerned about the implications of autonomy behind the petition movement and worried that Taiwan would demand independence.
A representative body for Taiwan would strengthen Taiwan's community identity and highlight Taiwan's uniqueness. So, the authority in Japan strongly opposed that idea. They did not want to see the emergence of Taiwan's national identity, and hence they could not accept the idea of a parliament for Taiwan.
All 15 petitions to Tokyo were passively rejected by the Imperial Diet. But history shows us that the petition delegation, led by Lin Shentong and others, made efforts to fight for the impossible.
やっぱり1931年に文化協会も弾圧で潰れますし、民衆党も勝利数がなくなってしまって潰れてしまって、台湾共産党も弾圧で潰れますよね。だからもうその組織的な抗日運動は30年代のもう初めにほぼ弾圧でできなくなってきて、でなおかつ日本の満州侵略が始まりますね。で日本国内の非常に雰囲気がだんだん変わってきて、いわゆる超国家主義というウルトラナショナリズムの世論がだんだん強くなる。それと軍部の発言権が強くなる。それからその軍部にを追随する右翼浪人みたいなものが跋扈するようになるわけですよね。
Even if the Taiwanese would continue their petition, there would be no result. So, Taiwanese people stepped back and tried to find another goal that was achievable.
In 1930, landowners and gentlemen who took part in the petition movement took a step back and started seeking local autonomy. Lin Shantang and Yang Zhaojia founded the Taiwanese Alliance for Local Autonomy. After 5 years, in 1935, Taiwan was finally able to hold partial local elections. Half of the local councilmen were elected. Voters had to be males over 25 years old, whose annual income tax reached 5 Japanese yen. This meant that among over 4 million Taiwanese, only 28,000 people could vote.
Most councils were advisory bodies in the government, so it constitutes partial local autonomy.
Under such a local election system, Japanese people in Taiwan, who numbered less than 270,000, became the majority in provincial and municipal councils. Even so, in 1935, some Taiwanese had their first experience in casting their votes in the first local election in Taiwan. Four years later, another election was held. Even though the elections were later suspended because of the Sino-Japanese War, Taiwanese people had gained some valuable experience in regard to local autonomy and elections. On October 25, 1945, Taiwanese people welcomed the rule of the Republic of China. Taiwanese elites had experienced local autonomy during the colonial period, so they had high expectations for post-war local autonomy in Taiwan.
民国35年5月1日，台湾省参议会第1届大会在台北
In 1946, the first island-wide representative body in the history of Taiwan, the Taiwan Provincial Senate, was established. 1,180 candidates campaigned for the 30 seats. The public was very enthusiastic about this election, perhaps more enthusiastic than during the colonial period. Taiwanese elites started to demand local autonomy from 1945, and they cited Sun Yat-sen's political theory. At that time, Taiwan was the best province in the Republic, with all conditions suitable for local autonomy. After the February 28th incident of 1947 occurred, Taiwanese elites used the newly announced Constitution of the Republic of China to ask for political reforms, including regulations for provincial autonomy and public elections of city and county mayors. After World War II, local elections carried out by the government in Taiwan were still part of the political tutelage system. This was not the parliamentary election based on the Constitution, which the Taiwanese had hoped for. They expected that the rule of the Republic of China would bring more autonomy. But the truth was, there was no difference between the rule of the Republic and the rule of Japan during the colonial period. On May 19, 1949, Taiwan Provincial Governor Chen Cheng announced martial law, which was enacted the next day, and the government promoted local autonomy under martial law. The government used an executive order to decide the content of local autonomy, so local elections were held under the control of the government, and the results would never affect the central government. It was safe, yet it was also an example of democracy. In addition, New elections encouraged Taiwanese to take part in politics and won their support for the government. The Constitution of the Republic of China stated that jurisdiction of local autonomy was protected by the Constitution. But Taiwan's local elections in 1950 were carried out based on an executive order of the government. Such local autonomy without legal protection limited the scope stated in the Constitution. The most obvious example was the provincial governor, who was appointed by the government, not elected by the public, as stated in the Constitution. Provincial Assemblyman Guo Yuxian criticized the fact that for the government, the Taiwan Provincial Assembly was merely an advisory body, not a representative body.
我们不能否认国民党统治那段时间，台湾经济。
We cannot deny that the Kuomintang or KMT sped up Taiwan's economic growth when they ruled Taiwan,
在这个威权统治里面，
but they also brought authoritarian rule.
像共产党没有的东西。
Nevertheless, this authoritarian regime kept local elections. These were the seeds of democracy for Taiwan. Local representatives were elected regularly, but election of national representatives in the National Assembly, Legislative, and Control Yuan started to see problems. In 1951, the first three-year term of members of the Legislative Yuan had expired. The election of the legislators became a major constitutional problem after the KMT government moved to Taiwan in 1949. After the KMT government moved to Taiwan, the authorities believed that they would counterattack China very soon. So they solved the issue of legislative elections by extending the terms of the legislators. President Chiang Kai-shek used the State of the Union address to ask legislators to continue to exercise their rights for one more year. Their term was extended 3 times from 1951 to 1953. In early 1954, the extended term expired again. At the time, the first-term members of the National Assembly and Control Yuan also expired. Extension was not the ultimate solution. They needed to solve the problem of election. On January 29, 1954, the Justices of the Constitutional Court issued Interpretation Number 31, stating that our state has been undergoing a severe calamity. All of the first-term members of both the Legislative and Control Yuans shall continue to exercise their respective powers before the second-term members are elected. The circumstances at the time made it impossible to amend the Constitution, so they solved the constitutional crisis by having it interpreted by the Justices of the Constitutional Court. Interpretation Number 31, issued in 1954, was very short, but its impact was profound, especially for Taiwan's political development. The problem with the election of the National Assembly was solved by using Article 28 of the Constitution. The term of office of the delegates to each National Assembly shall terminate on the day on which the next National Assembly convenes. This article was meant to prevent a political window period, but now it was used to solve the constitutional crisis. Through these methods, the government legitimized the non-re-election parliament that could not represent the people. The KMT government brought the constitutional system and the representatives from Chinese provinces to Taiwan. These two became the best tools for the government in Taiwan to claim that they still own sovereignty over China. As the country faced the pressure of survival, the government had to choose between suppression and constitution. In 1947, the KMT felt that legislative power in the Constitution might limit executive power and affect the war against Chinese communists, so they passed the temporary provisions effective during the period of communist rebellion in 1948 as an addition. Through the temporary provisions, the KMT government continued to extend the power of the president and solved constitutional problems revolving around the president. The constitutional system was twisted under the KMT's rule. In 1952, President Chiang Kai-shek held the National Defense Council, which was not in the Constitution. The predecessor of this council was the Supreme National Defense Council during the period for political tutelage. Jiang followed the system of political tutelage because he was familiar with it. He gathered all important officials to have the council, and he would have the final say. He also used the power of the KMT party to manage governmental agencies. Chiang Kai-shek set up the Unconstitutional Defense Council, and the premier, the chief executive under the Constitution, was required to attend the council. Even the general budget of the central government and major policies were discussed and decided at this council. This was similar to what Jiang had done in China when he was the head of state and chief executive. Such approach severely affected the present constitutional system. In 1966, the government amended the temporary provisions to systematize the Defense Council. But the premier, the chief executive, no longer enjoyed the decision-making power granted by the Constitution. After Chiang Kai-shek came to Taiwan in 1949, he alone controlled the party, the government, and the armed forces. He talked about the so-called revolutionary democracy, but in fact, he ruled Taiwan with an authoritarian system. Under the repressive political atmosphere, the magazine Free China, managed by liberals like Hu Shi and Lei Jun, became one of the few in Taiwan that dared to criticize the current political situation in the 1950s. They introduced the tradition of liberalism from the May 4th movement of 1919. To promote democracy and freedom, Lei Jun and Hu Shi decided to publish Free China. This was approved by Chiang Kai-shek because he believed that it could prevent communism from influencing Taiwan. In 1954, their editorial in Free China discussed the connection between the theory of natural rights coming from liberalism and the legitimacy of the Constitution. The Constitution became their foundation to criticize politics. In February 1960, the night before the National Assembly vote for the president, Lei Jun wrote an editorial in Free China urging President Jiang to stop extending his term, as such behavior was unconstitutional. Later, as a member of the Assembly, he did not attend the vote, so as to show his dissatisfaction with Jiang's decision to extend his term again. The KMT had deified Jiang, the leader of the authoritarian system. They granted him charisma and believed that nobody could replace him. But liberals from Free China believed that the government should follow the Constitution. Jiang had served 2 terms, so he should step down now. In May 1960, Lei Jun started the movement to form the China Democratic Party, which combined Democratic Socialist Party, China Youth Party, and local elites from Taiwan, including Wu Sanlian, Li Wanju, Guo Yuxin, and Xu Shixian. They wanted to form an opposition party, and they stepped on the red line of the party-state system. Lei Jun was charged and convicted of promoting for the communists on the day of sentence announcement. Chiang Kai-shek gave a clear order that Lei's sentence should not be less than 10 years. Jiang ordered to have Lei Jun arrested This was a major setback for the formation of the opposition party. It also cut off the connection and interaction between Taiwanese and mainland Chinese political elites. Afterwards, no one tried to form another opposition party in Taiwan. Lei Jun was arrested. Free China was banned. But the U.S., leader of the free world, after considering Taiwan's strategic value, ignored the incident. They also did not ask the authorities to start democratic reform in Taiwan. Correspondence between the American Embassy and the State Department around the time Lei Jun was arrested showed that the U.S. felt democracy was important for Taiwan, but also that progress shouldn't be rushed. The U.S. was worried that if the Taiwanese government was formed through democratic methods and decided to change their position on the communists, it might affect the U.S. strategic interests in East Asia. Under the disguise of constitutional democracy, the Republic was ruled by an authoritarian regime. The country had a non-re-election central representative body and local elections that were partially open. The society was controlled by the party-state system. To maintain such a system, external support was required in addition to internal operation of power. Under the framework of the Cold War, democratic countries led by the U.S. thought of Taiwan as part of the Asia-Pacific Alliance against communism. Karl Lott Rankin, the U.S. ambassador to Taiwan, once said the goal of U.S. aid was to enhance the defense capability of Taiwan and ensure that Taiwan supports the U.S. foreign policy. The present task is not promotion of democracy. All defense expenses were supported by the U.S. aid, so the government was able to lower the fiscal deficit, ease the pressure of inflation, and finally end the runaway inflation.
A lot had to do with the Korean War and with the North Korean invasion of South Korea, which in turn was followed by the Chinese invasion of the Korean Peninsula. And I think that created the impression in Washington that communist China was hostile to the United States, and we needed all the friends we could get in Asia. And on Taiwan, you had the remnants of the mainland regime, which were, of course, hostile to the People's Republic of China. And we saw in Chiang Kai-shek and his government at the time in Taiwan a source of support for the American position in Asia.
However, by the end of the 1960s, Sino-Soviet relations had changed, and the U.S. started to think about collaborating with the PRC to fight against the Soviet Union. Could the Republic of China on Taiwan remain the unsinkable aircraft carrier in East Asia for the U.S.? The first crisis occurred as the PRC started to take a more aggressive diplomatic approach in the UN. The U.S. commitment to guard the Republic of China as the only representative of China was shaken. In 1971, while the UN General Assembly discussed the representation of China, Henry Alfred Kissinger, the U.S. National Security Advisor, was visiting Beijing. This made the diplomatic situation of the Republic of China even more difficult than it already was. To maintain national dignity, and as the General Assembly was about to expel forthwith the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek, the Republic of China announced its decision to leave the UN.
The delegation of the Republic of China has now decided not to take part to any further proceedings of this General Assembly.
The withdrawal from the UN meant that the KMT government could no longer claim their sovereignty over China, and the international community would no longer recognize the Republic of China. As she continued to lose international recognition, the Republic faced the crisis of losing its legitimacy to rule. In 1972, President Richard Milhous Nixon visited Beijing. and it was expected that Sino-American relations would be normalized. As the country faced diplomatic crises, Jiang Jingguo assumed office as the premier and started to recruit Taiwanese elites to enter the cabinet. Li Donghui, a scholar of agriculture and economics, became a minister without portfolio. Aged 49, he was the youngest member in the cabinet. After 1970, the KMT started to open up its power circle to include Taiwanese elites like Li Donghui, Li Yangang, and Xie Dongmin. In addition, starting from 1972, partial election of the national representatives took place regularly to bring in new representatives into the non-re-election parliament. The seats to represent the Taiwanese people were added substantially. For the KMT, the partial election of the national representatives gave younger people the chance to participate in politics and express their discontent toward the KMT. Consequently, the KMT government could also continue to claim sovereignty over China. During the period of martial law, the relative freedom of speech during elections gave the people a legal vacation and liberalized their minds. Under these kinds of circumstances, political elites not in the KMT, the so-called KMT outsiders, needed the election to have a stage. Jiang Jingguo enhanced the KMT government's legitimacy to rule by recruiting Taiwanese elites and adding seats of national representatives. This was the first step to change from authoritarian rule to constitutional democracy, and it laid the foundation for democratization in Taiwan. In 1977, suspicion over fake notes during the magistrate election of Taoyuan County led to a violent mass movement, and people burnt a police station. This incident was known as the Zhongli incident. This was the first time since Taiwan had been ruled by the authoritarian regime that people demonstrated their will to fight against the regime on the streets. These elections were the engine behind the opposition movement. After the mid-1970s, the power of the engine increased, and the influence of the opposition movement was expanded. The Zhongli incident was a good example. Domestically, the government faced an opposition movement, and diplomatically, the situation was also difficult. Take Taiwan-US relations as an example. Secretary of State Kissinger paid his 6th visit to Beijing in November 1973, and he had not met Taiwanese ambassador Shen Jianhong for nearly 22 months. On December 16, 1978, Taipei time, the U.S. announced its decision to form diplomatic relations with the PRC from January 1st of 1979. Facing such a diplomatic crisis, Jiang Jingguo, who had only assumed the position of president for 7 months, announced an emergency order according to the Constitution and postponed the election of national representatives. The KMT outsiders lost the election stage and turned to street movements. They also published magazines to criticize politics. In 1979, the KMT outsiders, related to the magazine Formosa, established a political group. It was basically a political party without a formal name. This act was testing the limit of the martial law system. On December 10, 1979, members of the Formosa political group assembled in Kaohsiung and paraded for Human Rights Day. Conflicts between the police and the members occurred, and many people were arrested. This was known as the Kaohsiung Incident. The Kaohsiung incident caught the attention of the U.S., who demanded the authorities hold an open trial. Ray S. Klein, former Taiwan CIA chief who was a good friend of Jiang Jingguo, asked someone to relay his opinion on the incident to Jiang and suggested an open trial. After careful consideration, the authorities decided to hold an open trial for the incident. The defendants' pleas and arguments were broadcasted. The KMT outsiders demanded the government lift the ban on political parties and hold a general election of parliament. They won sympathy and support from the people. Compared with the silence after Lei Jun's arrest for establishing an opposition party, different social and economic conditions helped the opposition movement to gain speed after the Kaohsiung incident. After the Kaohsiung incident, the opposition movement in the 1980s gained social support, particularly from college students and intellectuals. This was very different from the opposition movement in the 1970s, when only political elites took part in the movement. From 1903 to 1960, Taiwan's economic and social conditions changed. Agriculture enjoyed an annual growth rate of 3.14%, providing capital, market, and labor force for industrial development. Land reform commenced in 1949, further helped to transform agricultural capital into industrial capital.
Traditional Taiwanese elites had funds to invest in land and became landowners and gentlemen. After the land reform, to maintain their wealth and social status, these elites changed the dominance of their careers from agriculture to industry and commerce.
Using capital from agriculture to finance industrial development, in 1963, output value of industry based on textiles and food exceeded agriculture for the first time. With an export-oriented economic policy, urban areas absorbed nearly 1 million surplus laborers from rural areas. Urbanization and industrialization happened simultaneously. Thanks to exports led by small and medium enterprises, before the 1980s, Taiwan often had double-digit economic growth.
Post-war Taiwan focused on fair economic policy, so small and medium enterprises had a lot of leeway for development. The KMT government considered itself as a people's government, so they tried to satisfy the people with their equalitarianism.
With rapid economic growth and relatively equal income distribution, the KMT could maintain stability of its rule. At the same time, the middle class was growing thanks to the accumulated wealth. Along with economic growth, another new group of middle class who used their expertise to earn money emerged in Taiwan. Empowered by new vision and perspectives, more and more people demanded democracy and social justice. The new class had new thoughts, and they would voice for their rights. Hence, during the important period from the 1970s to 1980s, all kinds of organized groups in various classes emerged to voice their dissatisfaction. The first was a consumer movement. Then, in 1987, the more political-oriented labor movement and peasant movement also emerged. The social foundation for these movements was the large number of intellectuals and college graduates, a reflection of the popularization of education. When the intellectuals joined social movements, there would be appeals for democracy, and this exerted a lot of pressure on the KMT government. The improvement of intellectual level and economic ability helped to spread new arguments. Economic growth became an important prerequisite for democratization. In addition to the streets and the parliament, the movement from overseas also played an important role to promote Taiwan's democratization.
We began to call for an end to martial law. We called for an end to the blacklist, which prohibited Taiwanese living in the United States who had been critical of the KMT from returning to Taiwan. We took steps to prevent the harassment and intimidation of Taiwanese in the United States by the KMT who were critical of the KMT on the grounds that it was utterly unacceptable for a foreign government to engage in efforts at intimidation of their foreign nationals while they were living in the United States.
In the 1980s, a series of political scandals and tragedies increased the internal pressure in the KMT government. Meanwhile, President Jiang Jingguo's health condition continued to deteriorate. He knew he had to make some arrangements with his remaining time. On March 29, 1986, a team of 12 members was formed inside the KMT to draft a plan for political reform. The plan included the lifting of martial law and bans on political parties, as well as general election of parliament. One of the 12 members, Vice President Li Denghui, felt Jiang Jingguo's sincerity with regard to reform. The authoritarian system in Taiwan would give way to political liberalization. On April 29, 1986, after meeting with Jiang Jingguo, Tao Baichuan came back to see us. He said the KMT maintained that the issue of national security after the lifting of martial law and ban on political parties should be solved by law. Scholars like Tao Baichuan and Hu Fuo played the role as the bridge between the KMT and KMT outsiders to avoid misunderstanding. On May 19, 1986, the KMT outsiders, including Zheng Nanrong, assembled in front of Longshan Temple in Wanhua. They were prepared to march to the office of the president to protest against martial law. Thousands of soldiers and police were mobilized to contain the crowd inside the temple, and the confrontation lasted for over 10 hours. But fortunately, the protest ended peacefully. In the 1980s, the KMT outsiders continued to enhance their organization. Finally, on September 28, 1986, the Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, was officially established in the Grand Hotel, 26 years after Lei Zheng tried to form an opposition party in 1960. Fu Zheng, who used to be Lei Zheng's secretary, was the key person to form the DPP. However, DPP participants left the Grand Hotel feeling anxious. Fei Xiping, a senior legislator and the convener of the party formation meeting, made efforts to seek information about how the authorities would deal with the situation. On the night the DPP was formed, Fei Xiping asked me to his place, and we discussed how to face possible arrests. I said the authorities would not make any big move. Fei said participants who led the party formation, including himself, had a discussion. They were all prepared for possible arrest. On September 30th, Liang Surong, acting as a communication channel, sent a message saying that the authorities continued to maintain the policy of peaceful communication with the KMT outsiders. In my opinion, this meant that Jiang Jingguo had decided to tolerate the formation of the DPP. On October 7, 1986, at the meeting with Katharine Graham of The Washington Post, Jiang Jingguo used the opportunity to announce the lifting of martial law.
Clearly there was pressure from the United States. My guess is that he felt that the relationship between Taiwan and the U.S. would be put in jeopardy if he didn't move in that direction. And I also think he probably calculated that even if he lifted martial law and permitted opposition parties, that the KMT would be able to hold on to power.
I think for Jiang Jingguo, opening up the option of formation of new parties was wise. This could ensure that the country did not need to pay a big price for democratization and allow the opposition forces to enter the system. For Taiwan, that was the start of democratization. I don't feel the government decided to let go and lift the ban on political parties. They didn't want to implement constitutional democracy. They only said so after the fact. The social movement forced the authorities to compromise.
宣告台湾地区自76年7月15日0时起解严。
Under the premise that the national security law had passed, Jiang Jingguo set 3 limits that new parties should abide by, including following the Constitution, fighting against communism, and no claim for Taiwan independence. On July 15, 1987, the martial law which ruled Taiwan for 38 years was officially lifted. The next difficult reform in the transitional democracy was the general election of parliament. If we elected only deputies that represent the Taiwanese people, it meant that the Republic had given up the vision that this country included the Chinese mainland. A country based only in Taiwan would need to have dramatic reforms in its national institutions. On December 25, 1987, Jiang Jingguo made his last public appearance. He announced that a general election of parliament was inevitable. On January 13th of the following year, Jiang passed away, and Vice President Li Denghui assumed office as the president according to the Constitution. Initially, as a person with relatively less experience and power, Li followed Jiang's plan to continue to promote democratic reform. On January 26, 1989, the Legislative Yuan passed the statute for voluntary retirement of the first-term national representatives. Those voluntarily retired would receive generous benefits. However, 1 year had passed and only 102 voluntarily retired. Some representatives even claimed that their retirement would localize the government and the parliament. In March 1990, members of the National Assembly attempted to amend the Constitution to expand their power, and this led to the student movement. The attempt of the National Assembly to amend the Constitution for their own power infuriated the general public. Hence, the Legislative Yuan passed the proposal to seek interpretation by the justices of the Constitutional Court.
把球丢给当时的。
The justices issued interpretation number 261 for the constitutionality of the non-re-election parliament. During the process of interpretation, the justices had to think about the judiciary's ability to handle such major political change and how detailed the interpretation should be. Following the trend of democratization, on June 21, 1990, the Constitutional Court stressed in interpretation number 261 that the periodical re-election of representatives is crucial for reflection of the will of the people and for implementation of constitutional democracy. To cope with the present situations, those first-term national representatives shall cease the exercise of their powers no later than December 31, 1991, and the government is further mandated to hold in due course a nationwide second-term election of the national representatives. In fact, the justices interpreted the Constitution according to the social atmosphere at the time, which demanded a general election of Parliament. It took courage and wisdom for them to make this kind of interpretation. But judicature should also follow the trend of the time. A series of democratic reforms gradually led the Republic of China back on the path to constitutional democracy. The whole nation also wanted to abolish the temporary provisions which froze the Constitution for so long. I propose to abolish the temporary provisions and that we follow the Constitution. During the period when the Jiangs ruled the country, we were having dialogues with an authoritarian regime by using our Constitution.
登辉自当立驻政府有关部门就征修条文规定的内容做密切的配合。
On May 1, 1991, President Li Denghui announced the abolishment of the temporary provisions, replaced by the additional articles of the Constitution. Later, several constitutional amendments were carried out by keeping the main text and adding new articles to fit the needs of the current situation in Taiwan. On May 9, 1991, after joining the Association for Taiwan Independence, graduate students from National Tsinghua University, including Liao Wei-cheng, were prosecuted for violating the Statute on Punishment of Insurrection and Article 100 of the Criminal Law, Preparation for Insurrection. Intellectuals started a movement in October of the same year, demanding the abolishment of Article 100. Thanks to the pressure exerted by public opinion, the Legislative Yuan passed the amendment to Article 100 in 1992. Nobody would again be charged for the offense against the internal security of the state for their speech or thoughts. Democracy isn't just about elections. It also includes whether or not the people have the freedom to express their opinion. People in a democratic society shouldn't fear what they've said or fear for their beliefs.
是废掉以后啊，我们希望未来我们的社会啊，从此没有所谓的思想犯。
From then on, freedom of speech was guaranteed in Taiwan. Various views started to compete in the political arena. During the period when the Jiangs ruled the country, opposition forces and liberal scholars had wanted a constitution with a parliamentary system. Compared to the parliamentary system, I believe that President Li Denghui preferred to push for direct presidential elections. However, I fear that if we had direct presidential elections, the president, who had direct public support, would want greater power. In 1990, at the Conference Nationale, which was an ad hoc meeting, a consensus was reached that the president would be elected by the people, but there was no decision on direct or indirect election.
我们今天讨论一个总统要不要直接民选的问题，讨论几天都还有很多人有意见。
In March 1992, the DPP and independent members of the National Assembly advocated direct presidential election at the provisional session. On April 19th, the DPP initiated a movement on the streets to promote direct presidential election. Even though the KMT was inclined towards indirect elections, there were voices supporting direct elections. Among them, President Lee Teng-hui's will was vital. President Lee wanted to amend the Constitution, and he wanted direct elections. I was concerned that a new authoritarian regime was coming. What was the theoretical foundation for this new regime? I believed it would be Taiwanism, promoted by President Lee. On July 29, 1994, the National Assembly passed the Third Amendment of the Constitution, confirming that the President would be elected directly by the people. In 1996, Taiwan had the first direct presidential election in the Chinese world. Lee Teng-hui won the election with a landslide victory. If the Premier's constitutional right to counter-signature was removed, he would simply be the Chief of Staff for the President, and we'd lose the parliamentary system. The Fourth Amendment of the Constitution allowed the President to appoint the Premier without the consent of the Legislative Yuan and granted the President more power. Presidential elections became the only way to enter the central government. In the presidential election of 2000, the KMT was split, and the DPP candidate Chen Shui-bian won the election with 39.3% of the votes. This was the first party alteration in the history of the Republic of China and an important step for a free and constitutional democracy.
The
KMT had the experience of ruling the country. Therefore, they knew that the new ruler could suppress them, using the country as their power. For this reason, they needed to raise the value of liberal democracy in discourse in order to fight against possible suppression from the new government. In 2008, the KMT nominated Ma Ying-jeou to campaign for the presidency, and after 8 years, the KMT was again the ruling party. The two turnovers prove that all people in Taiwan are willing to follow the rules of constitutional democracy to decide their future. Historically, we can see that the people in Taiwan had a difficult time in terms of implementing the kind of free and constitutional democracy that was developed by the West.
I think it was a model transition to democracy. It was peaceful. It was bereft of violence. And I hope it serves as a model for the transformation of the political system.
Sun Yat-sen once said, "The Republic of China is a country ruled by its people." On the Chinese mainland, years of battles and wars left the ideal of democracy no place to flourish. But it flourished in Taiwan, where the political environment was relatively stable. In the future, the Republic of China will continue to pursue its goal of being a democratic country based on constitutionalism.